Hi, my name is Tim Lloyd, and this is what is the name of this one? RA21 Seamless.
I don't know. Seamless trusted access.
Yeah,
Anywhere,
I just realized we
anytime.
didn't put it on the front slide. Um, Firstly, thank you very much. This is the graveyard shift of sessions. You chose wisely. I hope you'll appreciate that by the time we finish. This is an important topic. The three of us will be sharing the speaking duties, so just briefly to introduce us. Right next to me is Ralph Youngen, the co-chair of the RA21 initiative, and he's from the American Chemical Society. At my far end is Todd Carpenter, executive director of NISO, and on the RA21 governance committee. I'm Tim Lloyd, I run Liblinks, and I'm co-chair of the outreach committee. So we're all different backgrounds, but we've all got a very vested interest in trying to improve seamless access. So we've got an hour. We're going to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. I suspect you've got plenty. And with no further ado, we'll start off.
Thanks, Tim. So there have been quite a few calls for change around the way in which users authenticate to access scholarly content today. And I put two different variations on those calls for change up here. The first is a article from the Scholarly Kitchen by Letty Conrad after the ER&L conference, which is the Electronic Resources and Library Conference that occurred earlier this year. And you'll note just a few of the excerpts that we pulled out of there about our shared authentication systems being out of date and not up to expectations today, and that this is in need of immediate attention, collective attention here, and that there were more than a dozen talks at this conference on things like RA21 and link resolvers and things like that. What you may not be aware is that these same calls for change are happening outside of our scholarly publishing industry as well. On the right here, FIM for R stands for Federated Identity Management for Researchers. This is a kind of grassroots group of scientists that have gotten together to say, doing science is hard enough, but it's even harder as we are trying to remotely collaborate with one another. We don't have good research infrastructures in place that allow that collaboration to take place. We have to sometimes resort to things like Google Drive and Dropbox in order to share research outputs with one another. And this group is really calling for help from the community to basically have better ways of securely collaborating with their colleagues. Further evidence of the problem is the fact that this marketplace for software providers has sprung up over the last few years. You'll see the logos of different software providers that have emerged to try to solve this problem, to provide more seamless access to entitled content for researchers. And while these are good temporary solutions, we don't view them as comprehensive in nature. They're often paid services that you might have to purchase. They sometimes will disrupt the user's research discovery workflow, because if you haven't already installed or configured the software ahead of time, you're really out of luck. And they're not really based on standard authentication technologies, so you have to worry a bit about security, and in some cases also worry about privacy as well. You'll see the names of some of those companies that are running these services, and you should be a bit worried about privacy concerns as well. So as we've been working on RA21, we felt, okay, surely there's got to be a better way, a better solution here for the researcher access problem. And we really think that there is. There's an underlying technology called SAML, which many in the publishing space might know as Shibboleth, which is a particular implementation of SAML. This is a very tried and true secure security protocol that has multilateral trust as its underpinnings. It is widely deployed among publishers. It is widely deployed among academic institutions. It is widely deployed among corporate customers as well. And so RA21 really lives on top of this security software that we have all had in place for quite some time. But it's often an area of the publishing space that if you are a publisher in the room and are running your website, you may not really understand it all that well, understand what SAML or Shibboleth really means. So my colleague Tim is going to give a little bit of a primer on what it's all about.
Okay, so Hands up if you think you've got a good sense of what federated identity management is. Awesome. That means that almost everyone here will find the next few slides useful. So, while IP authentication is a pretty easy concept to grasp, federated identity management is more complex and, in our experience, not very well understood. It's laden with jargon, it's got acronyms, and what it does is obscure a series of transactions that are really actually pretty basic to understand. So I'm just going to walk through that. If you're unfamiliar with the term federated identity management, as Ralph just said, you might recognize the name Shibboleth. Shibboleth is an open source software commonly used to implement federated identity management. And because it's also easy to confuse RA21 with federated identity management, I'll make that clear. So I'm just going to do a quick run through and then we'll get back to RA21. So let's start with a simple analogy. Bob runs a conference booth. It provides books to anyone who studies at a subscribing institution. Amy comes up to the booth and says, "Hi, can I have a book?" And Bob says, "Sure," and asks her if she's at a subscribing institution. Amy says, "I'm a student at ABC College." However, Bob doesn't know Amy, so he needs to verify that she's actually registered with ABC College. Now, luckily, he's got a phone book where he can look up someone who can help him. And in the case of ABC College, the phone book says the person to talk to is Carol. So Bob calls Carol and asks, "Can you confirm that the person at this booth is actually from ABC College?" So Carol says, "Fine, no problem, I can help you. Pass the phone to the student and I'll talk to her." So Carol talks to Amy and is able to confirm with her that she's a valid student. Amy passes the phone back to Bob so that now Carol can say to Bob, "Yep, don't worry, she's one of ours. She's an ABC College student." Now, Bob would ideally like to know the student's name. He doesn't know she's called Amy. You do. Because he'd like to be able to recommend other books to her in future. He knows what book he's giving her now, and there could be some advantages to everyone for that. But ABC College's policy is not to reveal student names. So Carol can't provide Bob with any more information other than, "Yep, she's one of ours." So Bob's now verified that the student in front of him is at ABC College and the sort of authentication chain has finished. Bob gives Amy her book, and then he also gives her a bright green badge to wear. And that badge says, "I'm with ABC College." And Bob tells her if she wears this badge, then as she goes from booth to booth, each booth won't have to say to her, "So where are you from again?" They'll be able to know straight away she's from ABC College. Now, that won't prove it, but it means she doesn't have to tell them that step first. So it'll save some time. So this simple scenario is actually very close to how federated identity management works. So you have a service provider. In this case, Bob is the service provider. If you're a publisher, you're a service provider. And they're wanting to check a visitor's institutional affiliation before providing access to services. And sometimes that's called an SP, service provider. His phone book is the federation. So the federation is a trusted list that details how to talk to a set of vetted institutions and vendors. So if you're on that list, you've already been checked and vetted. And examples of federations that you may have heard of, there's InCommon in the United States, or the UK Access Management Federation in the UK. Carol is the identity provider. Sometimes the acronym is IDP. It's the institution's single sign-on service that confirms a visitor's identity. And while our characters here are all talking English, in reality, they'd be talking SAML. And finally, the badge that Bob gives to Amy is what RA21 is really about. It's making it easier for Amy to deal with other service providers and make access more seamless. It's also important to note that Carol was in control of the Amy identity here, and she opted not to tell Bob Amy's name. This might have been institutional policy. It might have been because she checked with Amy and Amy said, "No, I don't want my name released." Either way, all that Bob got was confirmation that Amy was a member of ABC College. And because Bob trusts the phone book, he trusts the federation, he knows that Carol's the right person to confirm that. And that is federated identity management in a nutshell.
Thanks, Tim. So with that understanding, you might say, okay, what's the problem here then? Because if this exists today, if we all support it today, why is this not just, something that everyone is using? And the reason is because the user experience that we have today around federated identity management is very poor. The idea of that green badge that Tim talked about sort of doesn't exist today. You would have to, in I think it was Amy's the student, Amy would have to go to each book vendor today and have that same dialogue and say, okay, where are you from? Let me call. And, that would be the experience today. What we're doing with RA21 is dramatically improving this user experience for how you can prove that you are a member of a trusted institution. And so RA21 largely is a user experience project. There's a little bit of underlying technology that I'll talk about in just a minute to enable that user experience, but we have been working on this user experience for quite some time. And so I am going to try to give you a demo now, and this is going to be a live demo of a prototype that works about 90% of the time. So we will give it a shot. So imagine here that this is a Google Scholar search result, okay? And as you would know, typically these search results point to different publisher sites. So the first one is an ACS site, the second is an RSC site, and the third is a Taylor and Francis article. So if I click on the first article here, I go to the ACS website. I have not interacted with RA21 yet in any way. So the button that I see down here says access through your institution. So on a one-time basis, I would have to click on that and I would have to basically have that conversation and say, where are you from? And this is a smart environment. So if I type Massachusetts, I see all of the institutions that have Massachusetts in their name. But of course, if I'm from MIT, I think I'm from MIT, not Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And so MIT would work as well, you can see there. So I don't have an account at any of those places, but I do have an account with a prestigious RA21 institution. And so all I have to do is click and I logged in through that institution and now I have access to the PDF. So now if I go back to my Google Scholar page and go to a different publisher website, you'll notice now the button has changed and the button actually says access through the RA21 test institution. I don't have to do that search again. The button magically knows what my institution is. So all I have to do is simply click there and I get access to the content. That's the user experience. That button is the equivalent of that green badge, that Tim just talked about there. So let me switch back. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay, so let me unpack this a little bit more and show you what's going on behind the scenes there. So there are really three different parties involved here. There's the publisher, the service provider, or the publisher. There's what's going on in the user's browser. And then there's this shared domain that I'm calling seamlessaccess.org here. And so the very first thing a publisher has to do is decide, where am I going to place this button? And you basically leave an empty space on your website for that button. And what the publisher puts in that spot is a call to a JavaScript. And that JavaScript has a few parameters, such as if the user does have to do a search for their institution, where should they go? If the user successfully authenticates, where do they go after that? And we're also debating whether or not the color of the button is something that could be variable as well. That would be another parameter to that JavaScript. So when the publisher's page is rendered in the user's web browser, the JavaScript is called, and the JavaScript looks in the local browser to say, has this browser gone through RA21 in the past, and is there anything stored here that would tell me what institution they're affiliated with? If the answer is no, if that browser storage is empty, it just returns the standard access through your institution button back to the publisher website, and where you can click on that button. And now I'm going to show you what that would look like if I had my own ACS specific search environment rather than the default search environment I showed you in the live demo. If I have my own publisher specific search environment, I might search for something like University of Oxford. And when I click on that, what happens is that goes back through the JavaScript and gets stored in my browser. That is what allows me then, when I go to a different publisher website that also participates in RA21, when that page is rendered in the browser, the JavaScript returns a button that says University of Oxford for that publisher. That's what's behind the scenes. That's really all that RA21 is doing, is just this dynamic button that is controlled by this JavaScript that we would all trust, on this central domain, that makes it easy for the user to log in through his or her home institution. So if the publisher's in the room, effectively to implement RA21, you have to decide where to put the button and you have to call a JavaScript. And that should be effectively all that you need to do in order to implement RA21. One of the lessons that we learned as we were developing this user experience really came from some comments that we got from the academic library community, which effectively said, well, wait a minute, you guys are spending so much time on this RA21 thing. Isn't open access really the solution to the researcher access problem? And that caused us to take a step back a little bit and say, well, yes, open access, if that becomes a very widely pervasive solution, that's fine, but it still doesn't solve all of the researcher needs. So RA21 really provides access to institutionally provided resources, whatever those resources might be. So for example, RA21 would be ideal for paying your APC charges for open access fees, because many publishers will provide institutional discounts for open access fees. And so we have talked to CCC about their RightsLink product, and they agree. That makes perfect sense to implement the RA21 user experience there, so users effectively have a one-click ability to prove what institution they're from to access those institutional discounts for open access fees. In the middle line there, this speaks more to what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation about the researchers with FIM4R, where they need to access remote research collaboration facilities. RA21, again, provides an easy mechanism for them to prove their institutional affiliation to provide that kind of access. It even could do something like, if you go to the Apple computer website and want to purchase an Apple computer using an educational discount, guess what? You have to prove that you're from an institution, from a university. No reason why RA21 couldn't also facilitate that kind of access to that institutional discount. And so we realized that we were kind of perpetuating this paywall mentality with the first version of our user interface. And so we've changed that recently and to more this open door kind of interface from that locking key metaphor. So all of the best practices around the user experience development that we've done over the past really 2 years, and we've had focus groups and face-to-face interactions with about 200 or so practicing researchers to develop this. All of this has been documented in a NISO recommended practice document that Todd will talk more detail about in a minute. These are a few of the screenshots from that document, however. This will effectively be a bit of a guide for publishers in terms of our recommended best practices for how to implement the RA21 user experience on a publisher website. So with that, I'll turn it back to Tim.
Okay, so I'm going to just give a bit more background here, because one of the hot topics around the use of single sign-on is privacy. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt generally about how SAML sign-on works and what libraries might be giving out and not giving out. And the more technical term for this is attribute release. When you authenticate, there's some data about the user that's released. So I just want to give an overview of how that process works, because the more you understand it at a simplistic level, the better you'll be able to see why this is such a good solution and why it protects privacy. In federated identity management, attributes are used to pass extra data about an authenticated user. They're shared by an identity provider, or IDP, with a service provider, or SP. And we talked about that earlier. So the IDP, the identity provider, is the institution that we're selling to. The service provider might be you as a publisher. The format an attribute takes then depends on the underlying technology. So many of us, we've been talking a bit about SAML, which is the technology that underpins Shibboleth and Open Athens. But there are other technologies that support federated identity management, such as OpenID Connect, which is used by services like Facebook and Google. So let's talk practically. Now, what are these? What are some examples of the types of attributes that can be passed as a result of a successful user authentication? So firstly, it could just be an anonymous ID. So it's one that's uniquely generated for every login and for every service provider, regardless of whether the user is new or returning. So this ID can't be used to support personalization because it changes every time the user signs in, so it retains user anonymity. So if I go the first time, I get one ID. When I come back, I get a second ID. You don't know who I am. You can't see that I've returned. And at its most basic, this could simply be an entitlement attribute. So all you as a publisher need to know, and it's the same as the case that with Bob and Amy and Carol, all Bob needed to know was that Amy was entitled to collect the book that she'd asked for. So anonymity completely preserved. A pseudonymous ID is unique to each person and for each service provider. So when I come back, it's the same ID that's provided as when I visited before, whether that's a week ago or a day ago or an hour ago. Because it's different across service providers, it can't be used to build a pattern of usage. So you can't start doing big brother tracking of people across provider sites. It's unique to each service provider, but it enables that service provider to see that I've returned. So it can be used to personalize the user's experience. Then there's a variety of organizational data fields that can be provided where necessary, such as a user's home organization, broader entitlements or rights, a role, a department or location. And then there's also more personal data fields, such as a name and email address. So why should you care about this? Attributes are important because they give both sides of the authentication transaction greater control. And this control can be valuable in a variety of different ways. So for example, the most obvious one maybe is access control. A resource can be limited to users who are full-time staff, preventing, say, alumni or contractors from acting a resource. So there's an attribute that could be passed that would identify that. Cost control. So you could have a resource that's limited to users with a certain role or from a certain department only. And again, an attribute could be used to support that. Risk control is a big one. So pseudonymous IDs allow users to benefit from personalization without requiring the user to separately register yet another username and password, without requiring you, the service provider, to collect personal information and credentials and all the risks that are associated with storing them. So some more basics about how does it actually work. So, attribute release is optional. An identity provider can simply assert that a user is a member of their organization and not send you any of this data. And it only happens after the user is authenticated. You as a service provider can't pull attributes. You can only receive what the identity provider sent you. One of the reasons I'm explaining this is because a lot of the fear and uncertainty and doubt in the industry is that the same thing that might happen with your phone where Facebook's hoovering up your data might happen here, and that's not the case. You cannot pull stuff that you're not sent. You can't demand things. You can't just take it. It has to be configured for you. So attribute release is configured by the identity provider, and typically it's done for categories of service provider. And so there's a number of valuable use cases, and access to library resources is only one of them. So for example, Ralph was talking earlier about research collaborations. So you've got academics working with colleagues from other institutions would need more data about each other. They typically want to know each other's name. And so in that case, a configuration would be set that would share more data than would be typical maybe for library access. Federated identity management could also be used by an organization to authenticate to services provided by vendors, such as a payroll service or maybe a communications tool like Slack. And again, in those cases, it may be more appropriate to share more information about a person. And then with library resources, our recommendation is for a much more limited set of attributes, and we'll come to that shortly. So part of what I'm doing here is helping you to understand that the identity providers, your institutions that you work with, they control this, and they have these configurations, and the amount of data you get really has to be agreed with them if it's anything other than the standard. So let's talk about some actual publishing use cases, because this maybe makes it a bit more real and not so theoretical. So here's a couple of example scenarios. So in the first scenario, we've got users are accessing full text articles on the platform where there's no option for personalization. All that the publisher or service provider needs to know is that you're entitled to view those articles. So in that case, all that's needed is an anonymous ID. In scenario 2, we've got users getting some content recommendations in the user interface based on their prior search history. So to do this, the service provider needs to recognize them when they return. So in this case, a pseudonymous ID could be used. Again, no personal data. They don't know I'm Tim. They just know that last time I came, I clicked on jazz and now I'm back again. So maybe I want to listen to some more jazz. The third scenario is where, say, there's a special feature that's only available to certain users. So in this case, maybe it's the ability to tap into prepaid funds to buy ebooks. So maybe the library's got this money. It wants to allow faculty members who, if they come across something they don't actually have access to, they can buy it as an ebook, but they don't necessarily want students to get to that. So in that case, that could be solved with a pseudonymous ID, so I can recognize you when you return, and something that indicates the user role. So I, as the service provider, can say, okay, you have the ability to buy this and you don't. And then the last scenario is an example where, say you've got some clinicians who are doing online training to earn a continuing education credit, and they need to receive a certificate by email that proves that they've got this credit. And so in this case, maybe a user email will be needed in addition to the pseudonymous ID. And it's important to note that this should be with user consent. But the idea here is that these are use cases which are not common in the publishing industry yet, but we want you to understand how this could be used to deliver a more engaging and personal experience. So let's talk a bit about what we're recommending, and then I'm going to hand over to Todd. So there's some important general principles here. We've adopted a data protection code of conduct from an organization called Géant, which is in Europe, and it manages a lot of the infrastructure for federations. This code of conduct contains some basic principles that we believe are really important to build trust and single sign-on by the community as a whole. You can read a longer statement about this on the RA21.org website, and there's a link there to the code of conduct. It's very readable. I would totally encourage you to read it. It's not too intimidating at all. But I want to flag 4 principles in this slide. So first, as a service provider, you should only request the least intrusive set of attributes you need to support your service. In other words, think of it about what you need, not what you'd like. For example, it might be nice to know someone's name, but if it's not necessary for the service to work, then don't expect it. Second, don't retain any additional attributes that you get sent and didn't ask for. So identity providers sometimes get their configurations wrong. So I was at the Charleston conference last year, and there was a wonderful example of this given in one of the sessions where a university IT department took their research collaboration configuration, which is designed for where they're working with other universities, lots of sharing, and applied it to a library resource. And so a whole bunch of publishers got sent way more attributes and information than they really should have been sent. And some publishers were retaining it, not because they're evil people, but I suspect no one was paying attention. So you shouldn't be doing that. Third, don't use attributes for other purposes without prior consent. And I should be preaching to the choir here about this, but it's worth stating regardless. So for example, if people are giving you your email address because they want you to send them details of their continuing education credits, don't add it to your spam marketing list. And finally, you should delete or anonymize all attributes when they're no longer needed to provide access to service. Don't keep retaining this data forever. Keep it as long as you need it and then get rid of it. So those are sort of general principles. And I really, again, go to the website, read the code of conduct. It's very easy to read. And it's the sort of statement that you can show a librarian. And if there are any librarians in the room? Yep. Wait. If you read the data protection code of conduct, I think you'll find it is very aligned with the sort of things that the American Library Association would say that they should sign up to. Okay, last slide for me. Specific guidance. So we're recommending that really you should be using anonymous or pseudonymous IDs only, unless there's a specific contractual agreement between you and your customer to use more. In practice, over time, this will become the standard that's built into these configurations. Right now, it might be a little bit more of a Wild West. Second, we're recommending the use of additional attribute where libraries want more granular usage reporting, maybe to support internal chargebacks. And so that attribute could be an opaque code that doesn't mean anything to you as the publisher. Code 4DF means the department at their end, but it could be really useful when you're providing usage reports or, say, counter reports. And lastly, it's worth noting that there's more work we're doing to investigate how to better manage this area. So a couple of examples. We're looking into the creation of standardized attribute configurations for the various library and non-library use cases I talked about, because the easier it is for libraries to implement these configurations and work with you, the more likely it's going to happen effectively. And we're also looking in more detail about attribute specifications for these granular usage reporting scenarios. And that's it. Over to Tom. Todd. Sorry. Tom. Tim.
Tim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the library expectations for privacy. There have been a lot of conversations, particularly recently, about privacy, and in the library community, many of these concerns go way, way back. And even though we're sort of living in a Facebook world where everyone presumes that all of your information is out there for free, that's really not the case. That shouldn't be the case for all of us. We don't, we have curtains in our house for a reason. But within the library community, the library expectations of privacy date back to the early 20th century, centered about World War I, and the fact that people were being jailed for using the library and researching, say, German history in the context of World War I. And so in the early 20th century, it was written into the ALA Code of Ethics that librarians should care deeply about protecting the intellectual freedoms of their patrons. And this has even been enshrined in law in several jurisdictions, that libraries should care about privacy and protect the patron's privacy. Even if the patron doesn't care, the librarian should take extra effort to provide privacy and anonymous use for library resources. So that means data gathering about patron activity should be minimal as possible. And in many institutions, there's been a preference around controlling some of these authentication systems, the proxy servers, for example, because the librarians have control of that authentication method. Some of them go so far as to wipe it clean, wipe the logs clean every evening, because they can say, you want data about our user? Well, we don't have the data. It's gone. And highlighting another TSK post from Lisa Hinchliffe describing some of these concerns, that control of the proxy server to them means controlling access to user data. Now, part of the challenge of what we've been talking about is we're moving into moving the authentication process into an institutional authentication system that is governed not by the library, but the institutional IT department. And as Tim mentioned, and Tim described really well, institutions are using SAML and using these authentication methods for a variety of purposes. They're using it for accessing the payroll systems. They're accessing their Slack accounts and Dropbox accounts, etc. So institutions are using these systems. But if I'm using, say, if an institution is using SAML for a course management, you need to know that Todd Carpenter is taking Psych 101, because in order to present Todd his syllabus and his documents and his grades, etc., you need to know a lot more about me that in order for that system to work. So it does exchange a lot of these additional attributes that the institution knows about me and what course I'm in, etc. You might need to know, if you're authenticating for payroll systems, you need to know a lot more information than this person is just attached to the university. You need to know the department, is that the chair, etc. So SAML provides a lot of flexibility. And librarians are concerned that, and there is reasonable as Tim mentioned, there have been instances where the IT department uses the SAML defaults for other things and is sending far more information than is required to provide library services. And I think it's critical for us as publishers who receive this information to send it back and say, whoa, hello, we don't want this, we don't need this, just send us a pseudonymous token, etc. That should be incumbent on us to do that and build the trust with the library community that we are acting in good faith um, when we're receiving too much information about patrons. And this gets again to some other things that Tim was talking about attribute release and privacy protections. And as Tim mentioned, we have adopted the GÉANT Data Protection Code of Conduct, which outlines in fairly legalese, although based on European law, it is fairly robust in its privacy protections, and it describes things like legal compliance, limitations of use, other issues around the use of these attributes. Ideally, we're not getting many of them, but realistically, we should be limiting our use of these materials. Another element of this, and again, I want to highlight this, that the IT infrastructure in most institutions that is handling SAML attribute releases and are working with the identity providers and the identity federation operators, that is separate and distinct from the library. And oftentimes, there isn't a great relationship and a great amount of trust and conversation between the library staff, even the technical library staff, and the central campus IT department. Last year, there was a presentation by people from OhioLink who had done a survey of the number of IT departments that had, within Ohio, that had dedicated IT staff for the library, and it was only about 15%. So this is the environment that librarians are working in, and we need to create tools and information for them. And RA21 and the outreach committee, which Tim leads, is going to be developing resources to facilitate the conversations between the library and the IT staff about, well, here's what you need to talk about with the IT department with regard to attribute release. And in a simple way, describe it for the librarians so that they can go talk to their IT staff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about process, because that's the most exciting part of this. The group has been working for a little over 2 years before we released. We're almost to 2.5 years, which is fantastic. Everybody complains that standards development takes too long, but this is a great project, and we're almost done in 2.5 years. We released for public comment in May, or in April, for a 30-day review period, a draft for public comment. We received, it was 120 individual comments, but those comments had, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. One actually went to U. So there, in total, there was, I think, 219 comments. And we had a comment resolution meeting on Tuesday and Wednesday this week here in San Diego. It was 11 hours of excitement, where we went through all of those comments and categorized them and wrote out and edited the document based on those comments and responded to each of those comments. We will post the next step is the committee is going to review the comments that the subgroup looked at and edits that they've made. We'll then take that and post the new version along with the comments and the responses on the NISO website. From there, it will be taken to NISO's topic committee, the Information Policy and Analysis Topic Committee. They will review it, and presuming that they are satisfied both with the comments and the quality of the document, we will then publish it. In an ideal world, that will take place before ALA. given the nature of 220 comments, I'm not exactly sure we'll be able to hit that deadline, but we did make a lot of progress this week, and I'm hoping that we can get the document out by ALA. We are now going to enter, once the document is published, we then need to take this as an idea and create it into a production service that all of you can use and all the libraries can use and users can use on their services. And that is going to be the point at which RA21 becomes the Coalition for Seamless Access. Now, the Coalition for Seamless Access is envisioned to be not another independent 501c3 association, but a coalition of industry organizations that represent the various sectors who are involved in this process. So that includes NISO and the International STM Association, but also GÉANT, which is an identity federation, as well as Internet2 here in the United States, ORCID, and we're also talking to IFLA to bring in a representation from the library community in this coalition. Now, if we're in early conversations with IFLA, if for whatever reason that doesn't work out, we will then try to bring in a different library association because we think it's really critical that librarians have a voice in the governance of this initiative. So we're envisioning this as a coalition to take this forward with a really light infrastructure where members of the coalition will contribute in-kind resources to the work of the group. So NISO is going to be focusing on outreach to the library community. STM is going to focus on particularly outreach to the publisher community, as well as support for the user experience, as well as a kind of secretariat, just kind of general management operations. GÉANT and will, through SUNET, which is another Swedish identity provider, will be doing the actual technical development and running the JavaScript and hosting that, 24/7, 365. And then ORCID and IFLA will also be providing, ideally, community engagement and conversations with different elements of the community. So the mission or the purpose is to develop and support these collaborative tools, as well as focus on these additional elements around not just the JavaScript, but the policy attribute releases, these other elements around RA21, which will help improve access to scholarly resources. To enable simple, trusted use of these resources, ideally anywhere, anytime, on any device. So, where are we now? We're in the process of wrapping up publication. Again, hopefully we'll have that done in the before the end of the second quarter, but that's a kind of train coming at us fairly quickly. In the second half, we will launch into a beta phase of RA21 in production through the Coalition for Seamless Access. We expect to have a running service sometime in the second half of the year, which publishers can implement in a beta phase in order to get feedback on, well, does the code work? Are we running into any security problems? What sort of user experience problems are we having? What kind of feedback can we get in this beta process? And then iterate and improve. And then in mid to late 2020, so about a year of beta, take the beta feedback in and then move it forward and out into wide production. So we are looking for people, organizations who are willing to participate in this beta process to test the feasibility and test the code, kick the tires, so to speak. And then working with us to build a network of implementations in order to test our structures and hypotheses. SUNET, as I mentioned, is going to be the home of the service, the centralized discovery service, as well as the JavaScript home. They're capable of running 24/7 infrastructure, something that, say, NISO is not. Uh, I don't want to be responsible for, I don't have a beeper running 24/7. They also have funding from the EU to support this infrastructure development. They've got, I think, 4 or 5 people who will be dedicated to doing the development work and maintenance on the project. Our expectations of beta implementers, so you all, would be that you'll implement the button, the service, and also provide feedback on how it's working. Uh, Things like success rates, user satisfaction with the process, how are you doing with support tickets, etc. We are not, I mean, we have talked about replacing IP authentication. I think we've kind of dialed that back a little bit because we recognize not every institution is going to be able to participate in an ID federation. Not every institution has the same technical wherewithal. However, we'd like to move more in the direction of pushing users into using ID federation services and making it easier for them when they're off campus. So with that, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Any questions or comments for any of us? Bill, we're being recorded, so if you just respond in the mic.
Hi, Bill Kasdorf. Um, am I right in inferring that these IDs that you're talking about are being generated on the fly by your system, or are there any standard identifiers anywhere in here? I'm thinking of organizational identifiers, for example. Uh, how do you know that organization is that organization?
Yeah, those identifiers are part of the underlying SAML protocol. The like pseudonymous IDs and anonymous IDs that we talked about are generated by the software itself. The institutional identity that you're describing there is also a standard, but it's a standard within the SAML industry called entity IDs that they have. So yeah, I mean that's all baked into the underlying protocol there.
But it's not an ID that we would know, like an ISNI or a Ringgold ID.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not. That's right.
And just to add, that's one of the critical roles that the Federation plays here. This phone book, it's got people managing it. You can't just get listed randomly. You know, you get checked, and those IDs are unique to each institution. So there's a whole infrastructure around that to make sure it's got trust built into it.
But I will say, Bill, yeah, and I think that the Federation operator space is open and willing to hear from us to say, like, maybe an ISNI would be really valuable, to have in their metadata as well. So I mean that's an open conversation.
Hi, my name is Willa. I just want to back up to one of the things you mentioned that was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is secure collaborative working tools that could replace things like Google Drive or Dropbox. How does the RA21 system enable that?
Yeah, it enables it by having a secure common method for researchers to perform that login, so that they can authenticate through their home institution. The particular software then needs to be provided by someone else, and this is an active area where there are software providers that are working at providing research collaboration tools like that. But what RA21 is basically makes a consistent front door, if you will, to those kinds of services.
So the institutional IT policies would also have to change for use of any such software as well, because we deploy a number of collaborative software products at our university where the institutional version of it will only allow you to collaborate with other users at the institution. Although if you were to pay for the
Hmm.
regular version of it and have your own
Hmm.
login, you could collaborate across institutions. So this feeds into it, but doesn't, it makes it possible,
Yep.
but more would have to be done to actually enable
Yep.
that collaborative working.
Yeah.
Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Yeah, we're providing that more seamless user experience on the front end, but not really impacting the kinds of back end decisions like you're describing there.
Ben Miller from Plus. I don't think we have too much kind of access control over our stuff, but um, what I was wondering is could we have the button anyway to have a sense of higher granularity of institutional access for materials?
You might think more broadly about how identity and access could impact PLOS. So as I think Ralph said, these aren't all just about access. You might, for example, have a feature where a user can get recommendations of articles. But in order to do that effectively, you need to be able to recognize them each time they come in. Or you might have a feature that's turned on for faculty because it's relevant to them, not students. Maybe it's related to ABC charges. So there's, think of it, and this is one of the challenges we're doing in the branding is, it started off really focusing on access, but anywhere where an institutional affiliation related to identity could be helpful in your product development, this is equally applicable.
Sanya, also from POS. Just a couple of notes. First, I did not see a specific screen where user authenticate themselves with the institution. Last thing we saw, you selected the
Yeah.
institution and moved on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, my demo was a little too smooth there because normally when I went to log in, I had already been. So actually, let me take a step back. My demo illustrated how it would typically work if, like earlier in the day, I had logged into a course management system or something like that. And so you're right, my login screen didn't even come up because I already had a session at my home institution, and it just logged me right in. So if you haven't done that, what I intended to show you, and it didn't show you, was I would have come up with a username and password screen the first time, and had to log in.
And along those lines, what are the session expiration? I assume
Those are
standard.
totally under the institution's control about session expiration and things like that, right?
Also,
Right.
they can say, you logged in, you have option to stay signed in
That's
forever.
right. That's right.
Yeah. So the point at which he went through, and again, we have an active session.
Yeah,
Um,
probably.
probably. It takes, when you click on MIT, it then takes you to the MIT login page.
I can show it.
You could
Yeah, go on.
end the session.
Yeah.
And it's also important to know that there is no user login information that is stored in as part of RA21. The only thing that RA21 stores is the preference of what the identity provider is.
The green badge.
Right.
So
So if I actually click on MIT here, this is the real live MIT login screen. And if I had an account, I could log in there.
I was going to point that out while you did it. I was like, wait, you missed a step. That was too easy. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jennifer Landsberg with South Press. So you seem to say that the IT departments of the institutions would be more involved in getting this set up. Have you validated that assumption? Because at least my experience with some institutions is that the IT department is a little disconnected or is not really interested in sort of setting up this kind of access.
I think the point we were making was that it's typically the responsibility of IT to do it. However, you're absolutely right. A lot of IT departments don't view library scenarios as one of the ones that they're really supporting. There's a lot of confusion in simple things like terms. IT might be far more focused on security, whereas the library is more focused on privacy. Chris.
And there has been we have trained users to not care about authentication when it comes to library resources. For the last 25 years of online access to resources, we have relied on IP-based authentication as a way to make it simple for the users. They don't have to think about it. They don't even, many users aren't even aware that there's an authentication process, except when they're not attached to the university's IP network. So that is creating this notion that, oh, I don't even have to authenticate. And when you're off campus, you don't have to worry about these things. The problem is nowadays, say if you have an iPad, if you move from one room to another, it might work in one room because it's got a strong Wi-Fi signal. On the other side of the room, it connects to the cellular signal and you're on a totally different network. And you as a user don't even know or care, but it totally messes with the IP authentication. So, Chris.
Hi, Chris Shillam with Elsevier, also involved in RA21. Just to give an anecdote there, I think this is often a communication problem more than anything else. I was actually on a call this morning with a US university, a customer of ours, I won't name which one. We're having a conversation about how they did remote access for their users, and they have a proxy server, and we were talking about that. And we actually said to the folks on the library from the call, did you actually know that 5% of your usage is coming in via Shibboleth, via federated authentication? They were completely surprised, right? It's set up by the IT department. It just works. Users have figured out how to do it, even without the RA21 user experience. And often the biggest problem here is just the communication gap within the institution, because more and more these identity management systems are being set up for course management systems, for HR systems, for grade management systems. They're just there and they work. The folks in the library aren't aware of this. And I think one of the key things we've got to work on in outreach is addressing that communication gap.
Yutaka Master from User Corporation Japan. I'm curious about the usage report after the institute implemented RA21. What kind of usage data they would receive?
Yeah, I can say that. First of all, this doesn't impact counter reporting at all. Okay, so standard counter reports will continue to work and be generated as normal. We are working. This request came especially out of the pharmaceutical space, where they're saying, the counter reports aren't sufficient for us, because what we want to do is we want to do internal billbacks to different departments based on usage. And so, as I think Tim mentioned, these attributes that are associated with SAML are perfect for that kind of a use case, because the corporation can say, well, these users are from this department and these users are from this department. And if they pass that to the publisher can then aggregate their usage according to that attribute and report that back to the subscriber in a way that's meaningful to the subscriber. And as Tim mentioned, it could be totally opaque codes, E42 and F27, and nothing that's means anything to a publisher, but would mean something to the institution. So that's something that we don't have that in place yet. That attribute specification for more granular usage statistics is something that we are working on.
Okay, one more question.
Sanya Bajovic from PLOS again. Thinking about rollout of this, you kind of have a chicken and the egg situation, whether, publisher will implement if libraries are not signed up and vice versa. So as far as the libraries and the work involved for them to set this up, is it really just simply, hey, I want this and here is my configuration, or is it more involved?
So the good news there is that this is largely going to be a publisher-driven rollout strategy, because many of the institutions already have the Shibboleth infrastructure in place. Around 5,000 institutions around the globe, higher ed institutions have that in place. So as publishers start to roll it out and those users start to see that button appear when they are off campus, that is how the rollout will occur.
All right. Well, it is now 2:45, and we have 1 hour. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions, comments, if you want to be more involved in RA21, please feel free to reach out to to me or any of the other RA21 teams. More information about the project is at ra21.org, or you can go to the NISO webpage. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.